And I trust that the time that we've been able to spend together this weekend has been beneficial to you as it has been to me. And I want to thank the elders for extending to me this invitation to be with you. But more than that, I hope it's been that which was pleasing to God. I want to invite you to reopen your Bibles. Appreciated Tim reading from Luke chapter 15. Reopen your Bibles to the 15th chapter of Luke. That's where we're going to be taking our remarks this morning. But I want to just kind of point out something to you that's way down in the chapter. And that is in verse 24. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now I want us to just stop and sort of contemplate just a little bit on that word lost. You know, I have to tell you, lost is a word that if it's used in relationship to us, very often it is that which instills within us a sense of dread or a sense of fear. For example, if a child is lost in the woods, can you imagine the angst that a mother and father would feel? Sometimes we lose an heirloom, perhaps a brooch or perhaps a ring or a necklace that's been in the family for generations. And when that piece of jewelry is lost, then of course that again brings a great sense of frustration and dread in many instances. But the worst thing that can happen is for someone to be lost insofar as their relationship to God is concerned. I'm going to come back to that. I want to revisit that in just a moment, because Luke chapter 15 is a chapter of lost things. If you read and study the 15th chapter of Luke, you're going to find that Jesus begins by telling three stories of things that are lost. For example, in the first story, he tells about a shepherd that had 100 sheep. And guess what? One of those is lost. And so Jesus points out that this shepherd will leave the 99 safe and secure, and he'll begin to scour the hillsides and the countrysides looking for that sheep that is lost. And finding it, he brings it back safely to the flock, and he rejoices. And Jesus points out that, you know what, this is the way that it is with God. When a sinner repents, there's rejoicing in heaven. Then he tells another story. He tells a story about a woman who had 10 coins. That's very often is a story that is confusing to us, because we wonder, why would this woman make such a fuss over losing a coin? Probably, according to some of the commentators, it was a coin that was affixed to the headdress that she wore. And that was very special to her. She loses that coin, and what does she do? She sweeps the house diligently until the coin is found. She calls neighbors to rejoice with her, and Jesus again points out that this is the way it is with God and with the angels in heaven over one sinner who repents. Now, I don't know how many of us can relate to losing a coin from a headdress or losing a sheep from a flock of sheep of 100. I don't think many of us can. But Jesus, in the third story that he tells in Luke chapter 15, tells something that will arrest the attention of every individual. He tells about a man who lost a son. He lost a son to the world. Now, I recognize and I realize and understand that the word lost, and this is even true among Christians, among religious people, the word lost is a word that falls upon hard times. It's not proper. It is not politically correct to refer to a young person that's living a life of sin as being lost. We don't want to use that terminology. So we won't say that he or she is lost. We may say that he or she is immature. We may say that this young person is just kind of searching for him or herself, just trying to get it all together, that they're just irresponsible or they're confused. But I got to tell you something. What Jesus is talking about in the third of these stories, and he gives the story of the prodigal son, he's talking about a young person that is lost, a young person that is in rebellion. This is what we're looking at here. We're talking about rebellion. And 1 Samuel chapter 15 reminds us that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft in verse 23. Rebellion is a sin. And this is what we're looking at in this story. We're looking at youthful rebellion. And I got to tell you, what I'm going to say this morning from this story is going to be very applicable. And if there's a lot, and I believe there are a lot of young people in this assembly this morning, and I'm going to be saying some things directly to you that I want you to pay attention to because it could alter the course of your life. And in doing this, I'm also going to say some things to mothers and fathers, giving us a heads up on some of the choices that we make and some of the decisions that we're faced with insofar as raising children are concerned. I'm going to have 5 points in this sermon. I'll tell you right straight up. I'm going to give you 5 points in this sermon, and I'm going to go through them. And I'll tell you what they are at the very beginning as it applies to this younger son in this story. My first point is going to be this young man comes to his father. That's point number 1. Point number 2, he comes to a far country. Point number 3, he comes to be in need in that far country. Point number 4, he comes to himself. And then point number 5, he comes home. That's the story. That's what we're going to look at this morning. But I got to tell you, even though it's very simple, it is fraught with a great deal of drama. And like I tell you, it's going to be very, very applicable. That's the reason that I refer to this as the journey of a rebel or a rebel returns. This is what we're looking at. So you remember what point number 1 was. This is where we began. Point number 1 is this young man comes to his father. Let's again notice some verses that Tim read. We'll look at verses 11 and 12. Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, now notice, he comes to his dad. And he said, Dad, something I need to talk to you about. He comes to his father, and he doesn't say to his father, you know what, Dad, I really appreciate all that you've done for me. He didn't say that. He comes to his father, and he doesn't say to his dad, you know, Dad, I'm so thankful to you and Mom for the love that I've experienced in this family and for all of the good things that have been provided me. He didn't come and say to his dad, Dad, I love you. He comes to his father. Now note what he says. He comes to his father and he said, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. I'm going to tell you what this is like saying. This is like saying, hey, Dad, I understand that when you die, I'm going to receive an inheritance, but guess what, old Pop? I can't wait for you to die. Give it to me now. I want what you're going to leave to me when you die. I want it now because I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to live in this household anymore. I don't want to live with you and Mom and my brother anymore. I want you to give me what I've got coming and give it to me now. I wonder how the father felt upon hearing such words of rebellion as that. And I tell you, that's what it is. It is rebellion. And I got to tell you, that's something that is occurring, I believe, on a regular basis, even yet today. Oh, we may not hear it in those words. We may not hear it phrased exactly like that, but it might go something like this. You know what? I just tell you what I'll let you and Mom know right now, Dad, when I turn 18, I'm out of here. I'm out of here. I don't like living. I don't like you just hovering over me like a hawk. I don't like having all of these rules. I don't like having all of these restrictions and all of these curfews. And after all, I didn't ask to be born in this family, and when I get 18, I'm gone. That's rebellion. That is precisely what this young man did. When he comes to his father and he makes that request to his father, you know, my friends, I want you to understand something. I want you to understand that there are, and I guess this is probably true of every generation, but as a younger generation comes up, they begin to disrespect the mores, and they begin to disrespect the ways and the virtue and the traditions of the older generation. And very often a younger generation will come along and say, you know what, it could be a whole lot better than it's been. As a matter of fact, I tell you what, I just don't even appreciate all that you believe, Dad, and I don't believe all that you believe, Mom. And you know what? I'm going to get out of here just as soon as I can. You've drugged me to church enough. You've instilled in me all of these ideas, and I tell you what, I've got some ideas of my own. I want you to listen to what the proverb writer says. In Proverbs chapter 30, beginning at verse 11, he says, there is a generation. Listen carefully to what he says. There's a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. You know, the Bible tells us that young people are to honor father and mother. And that's the first commandment with promise. It's going to go well with you, and you will live long upon this earth. But, he says in this verse, there are some. There is a generation who does not honor father and mother, who curses his father and is disrespectful to his mother. Does that sound familiar? Let's read on. There is a generation, verse 12 says, that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. They're self-deceived, they're self-serving, they refuse to listen to the wisdom of the older generation. You know what? I am gone. I am out of here. There's a generation, verse 13. Oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. They toss aside the values and the morals of the older generation. And that's something that's been going on since time began. And it continues to happen today. And parents, if we deny that, we're denying the reality of life. But I want you to notice something. I want you to notice what the proverb writer says in verse 17, because he's using some extremely figurative language here to let us know what happens when this generation curses its father and does not regard its mother. When this generation is lifted up in their own eyes. He said in verse 17, the eye that mocks his father and scorns obedience to his mother. He says the ravens of the valley will pick it out and the young eagles will eat it. What he's saying is, if you choose to live this way, you will suffer the consequences of what it is that you're doing. And I have to just remind you of something. That God will listen to me, young people, God will let you make choices and decisions in your youth that will haunt you for the rest of your life. God will let you make decisions that will destroy your health. He will let you make decisions that will destroy your relationship. He will let you make decisions that will destroy your soul. God is not going to grab you by the nape of the neck and keep you from making choices. This young man said to his dad, I'm gone. I'm out of here. Now we're going to see what happens. You know, I held a meeting down in central Kentucky a number of years ago, and I got a call. I got a call from someone down there before I went down to this meeting, and here's how that phone conversation went. He asked me, he said, JR, he said, did anybody tell you about Ben? I said, no. He said, well, I'm calling to give you a heads up about Ben. And he gave me a heads up about Ben. I went down and held the meeting. And during the course of their buildings are sort of like yours. It sits right on kind of the main street here, and people walking in front of the building on the sidewalk out there. And I was up preaching during the course of that meeting, and suddenly the doors to the foyer flew open, and in walked Ben. And everybody that sits there, that were sitting in the audience, they began to look at the aisle, and here come Ben down the aisle. And I stopped what I was doing because Ben was mumbling something, and as he got closer, I could hear him louder, but I couldn't understand what he was mumbling. And I looked at Ben. His hair was all disheveled. His shirt was a mess. He was dirty. And as he got closer, I noticed that saliva was coming out of his mouth, and he was just drooling all over his shirt. And he come in and he sat down on the front row, and he looked up at me, and he had his hands up like this, and he was mumbling something, and I couldn't understand it. And so finally a couple of brothers come and escorted him into a room, and we calmed down and we continued on with the service. Ben. You know what happened? Listen to me now. When Ben was about 14 years old, he and some of his buddies thought it was the neatest thing in the world to go down to the True Value hardware store and steal these cans of clear spray paint. And they would go out behind the gym there at the local high school, and they'd take an old dirty ball sock, and they'd begin to spray that paint in that ball sock, and they'd begin to pull it down into their lungs, and they did that. And oh, that was the coolest thing to do. But some of those guys quit. Ben kept it up. And now Ben was in his early 30s, and he couldn't string two words together. The eagles will pluck it out. It's what the Bible says. You make decisions like that can destroy your life, and God will let you do it. He's not going to keep you from making those kinds of choices. Now, before I move on to point number 2, can I say something about this boy's father? Remember, the young man comes to his dad and says, you know what? I'm gone. I can't wait for you to die. Give me the inheritance now. He's making that choice. But you know, there's 2 things about this father that I think are very admirable. And I don't just mean him standing at the, watching for his son to return. That's admirable, yes. But there's 2 things about this father that I think is extremely admirable. And that is, he learned something, or he knew something, ladies and gentlemen, that a lot of parents do not know and do not understand and have not learned. This father was not about, listen to me now, he was not about to lower his values to keep a rebel at home. Mothers and fathers, are you listening to me this morning? He knew that a rebel leaves in his mind before he ever leaves in his body. That boy had already decided how he wanted to live. And that father was not about to say to him, now son, I don't want you to leave now. Why don't you just bring your harlots home? He didn't do that. He didn't say, son, I want to keep you at home, so why don't you just bring your riotous living into my home? That father was not willing to do that. He was not willing to lower his morality to keep a rebel child at home. And parents, we can learn from that. It is heartbreaking to see parents lower their standards in order to keep a rebel at home. I've heard parents say, well, you know what? If Johnny's going to drink, I'd rather him drink at home. If Susie's going to commit a fornication, I'd rather she do it safely, and I'll provide her with birth control. What is the matter with us? Are we lowering our values in order to keep a rebel at home? It's not going to do them nor us any good. I'll tell you something else I admire about this father. He wasn't about to bail that son out. He was going to let that son suffer the consequences of his decision. This father would have had the wherewithal to send a servant out to follow that son. Now listen, you make sure if he gets in a tight spot, you bail him out. I don't want him to get hurt. And I don't want him to do anything that's going to bring shame on. Don't let him do that. So if he gets in a bind, you bail him out. No, his father didn't do that. That son had to suffer the consequences of his decision. And that is something that I admire greatly about that father. He let that son understand what the proverb writer says in chapter 13 and verse 15, that the way of the unfaithful or the transgressor is hard. He let him go. And the boy had to stand or fall on his own. Now, did he worry? I'm certain that he did. Did he cry over this child? I'm certain that he did, as any father would have done. Did he pray? I'm certain that he did. But he let the boy suffer. So the boy comes to his father. He said, give me the portion of goods that fall to me. And he gave it to him. And the boy left. And that brings us to our second point. Not many days, verse 13, not many days after, the younger son gathers all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal, which means wasteful, living. Now look very carefully at that. I've got the words in my Bible, far country, underlined. And I did that for a reason. Because if you look into that chapter, you can't answer the question as to where the boy went. It just says he went to a far country. It didn't say that he went to Alexandria, Egypt. It didn't say that he went to Babylon. It didn't say that he went to Athens. It just says that he went to a far country. And do you know why that's significant? Because insofar as the Bible is concerned, a far country is not a place on a map. A far country is not where you can put your finger and say, that's the far country right there. Because a far country is measured not geographically, not on a map, but it's measured how far one drifts from God. Jesus said, they honor me with their lips, but what, Matthew 15? Their heart is far from me. You don't have to go to New Orleans, Louisiana. You don't have to go to San Francisco, Paris, or Amsterdam to be in a far country. You can be in a far country while you live in Ellettsville. Because a far country is measured not on a map, but how far you've gone from God. And this, ladies and gentlemen, I believe is a crisis. We've got young people who are regular in attendance, who are the offspring of well-respected parents, who are able to memorize Bible verses. But you know what? They are in a far country and mom and dad don't even know it. You know, it's been my privilege, and I consider it to be a privilege, of working with young people. I have for years, whether it's at summer camp or whether it's in young people's lectureships. I love working with young people. And as a result of that, I have become a student of body language. I can read the body language of young people. And you know what? Let me give you for instance. When I'm teaching a group of young people and I see some young man sitting there in the chair as if he has no backbone and he just slumped over like this. And his eyes are just, I say something, he just rolls his eyes, or she does the same thing. Then I can tell you one thing that I've learned. I've learned that person may be here in body, but his mind is in a far country. And Mom and Dad, it's high time that we begin to read some body language. How they dress, what they listen to, the choices of the friends that they have. Because they may be good kids at home while they're with us, but I'll tell you what, once they get married and once they go off to college, once they move on the other side of town, then I'll tell you what comes to the surface is what's been there all along. I've left the Lord. He doesn't mean anything to me. And I tell you, this is something that is, you know, you ask a young person, what is it you want? They're not going to tell you, well, I want to go to a far country. They don't tell you that. But you know what? I tell you what this far country represents here. It represents freedom. It represents breaking the bonds of parental oversight, making my own decisions, making my own choices, doing what I want to do without having someone standing over me and keeping me from doing what I want to do. I guess it's kind of like, if you name this far country, we might call it freedom or liberty. But I'm going to tell you something right now, and I want you to listen carefully to me. There is no such place. It doesn't exist. You cannot live violating various laws and expect to ever survive. You can't violate the laws of sanitation. If you did, we'd all just keel over with typhoid. You cannot defy the laws of gravity. You get up on top of a building and walk off, you can't fly. That's just all there is to it. Now, how stupid would it be to say, you know what, I'm just tired of living according to the laws of gravity, and I'm going to just step off of this 14-story building. Not going to happen. You're not going to break the law of gravity. You'll break yourself when you hit the ground. And that is precisely the way it is with the laws of God. You cannot live in violation to the laws of God without destroying yourself in the process. I want you to listen to what the Apostle Peter says. In 2 Peter chapter 2, and I know in the context what he's talking about here, but I want to make this application. Notice what he says in verse 19, while they, 2 Peter 2 and verse 19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. You do not know what bondage is until you give yourself over to sin and it grabs you and controls you. As Paul said in Romans chapter 6 and verse 12, sin reigns in your mortal body. Let me go back in time. I told you last evening that I wasn't raised by Christian parents. Not at all. I didn't become a Christian until I was 25 years old. I experienced what a lot of young people think that they want to experience growing up. I remember Mom and Dad used to go down to a camp down on the Ohio River. Some of my uncles had down there. And grown-ups would sit around playing pinochle or horseshoes. Kids would be swimming in the river and running in the cane brakes and doing all kinds of things. Well, I tell you what we did. And I'm not proud of it. I'm ashamed of it. I tell you what we did. All the adults, you know, they had their coolers of beer over here. All we had was Orange Crush and RCs. And those Orange Crush that we had, you know, they came in brown bottles at that time. So I tell you what we did as kids. We used to empty that Orange Crush out, rinse it out, and then we would go steal a beer from the adults' cooler. And we'd fill that Orange Crush bottle up with that beer. And then we'd just walk around in front of the adults drinking that. We thought we were cool, man. We thought that's neat. We're pulling one over on the old folks, and they're too foolish to even realize it. My sister did that. My sister's 2 years younger than me. My sister did that, but I'll tell you what happened to sis. What happened to my sister was that she, just like Peter's talking about here, she became enslaved to alcohol. She became an alcoholic. Oh, it's cool when you're about, 15, 16 years old. That's a neat thing to do. But I tell you what, when I stood beside my sister while she was on an IV being admitted to a rehab center, and I heard the woman ask her, what is it that you drink? And my sister said, I drink anything that I can get my hands on. There's nothing cool about that. And a few years after that, I preached my sister's funeral. Don't you realize that you don't know sin and you don't know corruption and you don't know bondage until you give yourself over to it? This boy went into a far country and he was enslaved in that far country. Now let's notice point number 3. He'd gone to his father, he'd gone to that far country, and now while he's in that far country, he is in need. Let's continue our reading. This time verses 14, 15, and 16. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want or in need. He ran out of money. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. Don't you see where this is going? He spent all of his inheritance. And you know what? I would say while he had all of that money rolling in, he had more friends than you could shake a stick at. Well, look what happened when the money run out. Nobody would even give him anything to eat, and he's going to go over and eat with the hogs. You know, when Sue and I were raising our children, one of the things that we always emphasized is developing in them a good work ethic. All of our children, all 3 of our children had jobs when they were 15 years old. Now, that didn't neglect their schoolwork, they didn't neglect their church responsibility, none of that. But they had jobs. We were trying to instill in them a strong work ethic that they maintain yet to this day. Our son, who is the middle child, I would have looked at it, if I had been his age, as an ideal job to have. We were living in Hendersonville, Tennessee at the time, which is north of Nashville. He got a job at an apartment complex picking up trash and cleaning out the pool and just kind of general maintenance that a child could do around that apartment complex, making pretty good money. Well, he made enough money that he wanted to buy a car. And there was a guy at church that had this old 1972 Volkswagen Bug, Beetle. And my son fell in love with that old Bug. Now listen, if you got a Volkswagen, I'm not throwing off on you. That's not it. I'm just telling you the way this thing came down. So our son bought that Volkswagen. And he paid for his insurance, and when he, bought it when he could get a license, paid for his insurance, and he would drive that thing back and forth to school. And you know what? I would stand out there sometimes in the driveway. We had a basketball goal there, and all these boys like to come over there. And I told my wife, I said, I didn't know you'd get that many kids in a Volkswagen. They just come in, that thing was just loaded down with kids. And they'd come over there, and they'd all pile out of that Volkswagen. They'd play basketball after dark, and then they'd all run up to Dairy Queen, get some ice cream, and then finally here come Dwayne and that Volkswagen come back in. And I asked him one day, I said, hey, you notice, I noticed you hadn't been doing any homework. I said, you don't have any homework to do? This is back. I love it the way it is now. You can get online and find out what a kid's doing in school. I love that. Now, you young people might not like that, but that's the grandest thing that a parent ever come across. We didn't have that back in the day. And so we kind of had to wait for 6 weeks intervals, And I said, I noticed you're not doing any homework. Oh, I get it done at school. Or I didn't have any homework. I said, they're not giving homework anymore? Well, Dad, don't worry about it. I said, let me tell you something. I said, if you come home bringing some bad grades, I said, you're going to park that Volkswagen in the driveway, and I'm going to keep the key in my pocket. Well, I come in from the office one day. There's old Dwayne. He sat at the table, looked like he had been beat with an ugly stick or something, and he'd just all been up out of shape. And I said, son, what's the matter? And he stands up and he hands me his report card with this hand and the car keys with this hand. And we park that Volkswagen. And you know what's interesting about that? Is the phone stopped ringing and there wasn't nearly as many kids coming around. And pretty soon there were none coming around. And you want to know why? Because the reason that they were hanging out with him was parked in that driveway. And that's what we see here in the story of the prodigal son. When he ran out of money, he ran out of friends. And I would to God that young people understood that those people in the world that you think are your nearest and dearest friend, they don't care about you at all. They don't care. They'll get from you whatever you're willing to give to them, and when what you give to them is gone, so are they. The ones who love you and the ones who care for you are the ones who nurtured you, brought you into this world, raised you, clothed you, fed you. These are the ones who care. And you know what? You just think about it like this. Let's suppose that you know where you can go to buy booze as a young person. Well, I tell you what, you buy that, and you think the people that are selling it to you are cool, and you get out here on the highway and you wrap your car around a tree. Do you know who's going to pay for the funeral? Not the guy who sold you the beer, not the guy who sold you the booze, but it's mom and dad that's standing in the funeral home making the plans. Yeah, you can go ahead and you can consume tobacco products. You can put the pin between your lip and your gum, and you can develop oral cancer, and I'll tell you what, R.J. Reynolds will not send a flower. They don't care because they got from you what they want. And then they'll toss you aside, just exactly what we're seeing here. When my grandson Adam was born, he was born with some lung problems, and they put him in the neonatal unit at Riley Hospital. And he was in an incubator or some kind of apparatus down there for about a week, and I'd go down, and I was standing down there with my daughter one day, and there was Adam and that little bassinet thing there. We're looking at him. He had them things all hooked up to him. And my daughter says to me, she said, Dad, you see that girl down there? And I said, yeah. She said she's 17 years old, so she just had a child. So she had a relationship with a guy that was 22 who promised to love her and promised that he's going to be with her from here on out. And she got pregnant and she had a child, and that child was born with Down syndrome. And he walked in and saw that child, and he looked at that girl in the face and he said, "I'm out of here. This is something I can't handle." All of those promises that you get from the people, they don't care about you. I'm telling you the truth. They don't care about you. They'll get from you whatever they can. The only ones who care about you are the ones who brought you into this world. This boy went to a far country and he came to be in need, and all of those so-called friends, they left him like vapor. Which brings us to point number 4. He finally came to himself. Let's look down. Verse 17, when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger?" I hope you got your Bible open. I'm going to ask you a question. Look very carefully at that verse, verse 17. Why do you think he came to himself? Why did this young man come to himself? You know, I had a fellow ask me that one time. He was a recovering alcoholic. He'd been a drunk for 14 years, and he finally got dried out. Now he was living a life of sobriety and faithfulness to God. We were studying our Bible together one time, and he said, "J.R., I want to ask you a question." He said there in verse 17, he said, when the prodigal son came to himself, why did he come to himself? You know what I told him? I said, well, he got about as low down as a man can get. You can't get lower than that, feeding pigs and wanting to eat with the pigs. I said, when you get as low as you get, why, that's when you come to yourself. He said, that's not the answer. I said, really? I said, what's the answer? And he pointed something out to me that I had read 100 times, maybe more than that, and failed to make the connection. But look at the last sentence of verse 16. And no one gave him anything. I'll tell you, my friends, when we stop bailing people out or we stop enabling sinful behavior, then and only then will people come to themselves. Yeah, they walked away from him, but you know what? That redounded to good, because now he's got to do something about his condition. And he came to himself. He said, you know what? I'm not going to live this way anymore. If Mom and Dad will have me, I'm going home. If they'll have me. Like a young woman that I knew about one time. We used to worship with her. She was a teenager where soon I obeyed the gospel. She had a beautiful high soprano voice. As a matter of fact, when we would sing these psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, you could hear her voice just sort of reverberating all over. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And the world recognized it too. They gave her a musical scholarship in Boston, Massachusetts. And as a matter of fact, I remember when the church kind of had a little going away for her. She's going off to college. This was back in the day. And off to college she went. Well, you know, it wasn't long after she went up there, we stopped hearing anything from her. Her parents didn't hear anything from her. I don't know what happened to her. So we got some money together and sent the local preacher up there to see if he could find out what's going on. He got up there, found out she had dropped out of school. Nobody knew where she was. Wasn't going to church anywhere. People hadn't seen her. Didn't know what happened. He come home, man, we were all devastated. We had prayer meetings for her. We just worried to death about her. Now, what I'm about to tell you, we found out later. While she was up there, and you know what? I'm talking about a young woman, probably like some of the beautiful young ladies in this assembly here. Went to church all of her life. Good parents. Good family ties there. Active in the local church. But when she got up to college, she got introduced to drugs. Those drugs became a gateway to heroin. She was a heroin addict. And she maxed out everything that she had, sold everything that she had to support her habit, and the only thing left she had to sell was her body. She prostituted herself. She'd walked the streets of Boston. She had a pimp. She made a mistake one time and wasn't taking care of the birth control, and she got pregnant. The pimp beat her and forced her to have an abortion. So one night she got all painted up and she was getting ready to go out on the street again, and she got to thinking about home. She got like this prodigal son, you know, I've come to myself. She calls it the cab. The cab comes over and she takes an old brown sack and she puts what clothes are fitting for her to take back to Kentucky with her in that sack. She wipes all of that makeup off and she goes out. When the cab gets there and she gets in the cabby could see that she'd been crying. He said, "You want to talk about it?" She said, "Well, not really, but I need to talk to somebody." And she explained to that cabbie what life she was living and what she was doing, and she said, "Please take me to the bus station." This cabbie takes her to the bus station. He goes in with her, and he, out of his own pocket, buys her a one-way bus ticket to Louisville, Kentucky. And he waits there until she gets on that bus and she goes home. And she says to her mom and dad, "You know, I want to come home." This was a turning point in this young woman's life. And this was a turning point in this young man's life. He came to himself. I don't have to live this way any longer. Now, I got to tell you, everything doesn't end up that way. That young woman came back. She's faithful to God today, married, wonderful children who love the Lord. The prodigal son, he came to himself, and we're going to see that he finally comes home. That completes the journey of a rebel. But you know, the Bible talks about two prodigals. Did you know that? There's a prodigal in the Old Testament as well as a prodigal in the New. The prodigal in the Old, he didn't make it home. That was Samson. So statistics show that 50% of the prodigals die in their sin. This young man came to himself and he says, "You know what, I'm going home. I'm going to go back home. If Mom and Dad will have me, I'm going back and see if I can just get a job cleaning out Dad's barns." So finally, he comes back home. We continue our reading now by looking at verses 20 through 24. "And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion on him and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him," now the son said exactly what he had rehearsed, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here and kill it. And let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to be merry. The journey is over. The boy is back home again. Look at the love and the festivity that's expressed in these verses that we just read. Look at the warmth between that father and that son. When that son, now I'm not talking about the older brother, that's another story altogether. But I want you to notice what that boy said. That boy said, "Dad, I sinned." He didn't say to his father, "Dad, I made a mistake." He didn't say to his dad, "You know what, Dad, I'm no different than any of the other young people my age." He didn't say that. He didn't say, "Dad, every young person goes through a rebellious stage." He didn't say that. He said, "I have sinned before you and before heaven." He owned what he did. And I'm going to tell you something else. I want you to notice what the father did not say to the son. The father did not say to the son, "Why, how dare you show your face around this house again? Look what you put your mother and me through. You've drug our names through the mud. How dare you show up?" He didn't say that. He said, "My son was dead and now he's alive. My son was lost and now he's found. That's all that matters." And it was a homecoming. And what a homecoming it was. I'm going to tell you something, my friends. Rebellion is its own reward. And I hope I have said something to some of the young people here this morning that makes you realize that rebellion is its own reward. It will alienate you from family. It will alienate you from God. It will put you in the valley of sin, and you will hear God say one day, "Depart from me." But you don't have to live that way. You can come home as well. Because you know what? God is still calling the prodigal home. Is there one or more prodigals in this assembly this morning? Let me tell you, your Father loves you. God is standing at the portals of heaven, watching and waiting for you to return to Him. If you believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repent of your sins, come to yourself, confess your faith, and be baptized in water for the remission of your sins. If you've done that and you found yourself in a far country, come home while there's time and while there's opportunity. God is calling the prodigal home. If you're subject to the invitation, we urge you to come right now as together we stand and as we sing the invitation song.